There once was a king who leased his lands to a poor farmer, and after a bad year of crops, approached the farmer for his coin. Of course, the farmer could not pay. The king said, "Tomorrow I return to play a game of stones, and we will decide your fate." He said, "Tomorrow I will arrive and I will pick from the ground a dark stone, but I will also pick up a white stone. I will place one in each of your daughter's hands, your eldest daughter, the beauty of our kingdom. If you choose the light stone, well then, your debt is forgiven. If you choose the dark stone, well then, my friend, your daughter comes with me to the castle and becomes my bride at last." That night, the daughter convinced her father he must play the game. Otherwise, he will be thrown into debtor's prison and they would starve. And anyway, they had a 50% chance of winning. And so the next day, when the king arrived, the farmer said yes, he would play. The daughter stood, her palms open, and the king reached to the ground. But the daughter, quick with her eye, saw that the king had actually picked up 2 dark stones, and he placed them in her palms, closing her fingers around them. She was horrified. Could she expose the king? No, he would have off with her head. She cannot call the king a cheat. On the other hand, if she says nothing, then her fate was sealed. Now this story is important when you think about our American political system. The moral of the story is only when you know you have 2 black stones in your hand can you actually consider what to do about it. Had the daughter not been observant, she would have lost without even a fight. And my friends, that is exactly what is happening to you and I in today's American government. You see, we are represented by politicians who receive sometimes 10% of the eligible votes and still win the office. Sometimes 20%. But even our modern presidents do not receive even 30% of eligible votes. This election has invited me to become involved in trying to understand why. Was it the money? No. Because if enough people work together as small donors, they can overcome the money gap. Is it the rigged election? Well, that's getting closer. But it isn't the rigged election that you are aware of. Gerrymandering, closed primaries, superdelegates. No. Those are the mechanisms the parties themselves use to ensure they nominate the people they want to run. The party establishment candidates. There are also the ways that they fight between the two major parties. But the reason that the 2 major parties have a monopoly on our government, even though they are elected with a small fraction of the eligible votes, is something called first past the post voting. I would almost wager that 99% plus of Americans have never even heard of that term. I had never heard of it until my son taught me. He said, "Dad, you can fix everything in American politics and you will still have the same result if you do not tear out the root cause. If you do not know you have two black stones in your hand." And when I started to look at first past the post, I understood why. I looked at the elections since George Washington, and we have always had this two-party monopoly or duopoly. Third parties have zero chance of winning. Somewhere around 20% of Americans will vote gladly for Donald Trump and 20% gladly for Hillary Clinton. Another 5 to 10% will be your hold their nose voters who are voting for the lesser of two evils. You know who you are. The rest of us, around half of the American electorate, will either vote, a small fraction will vote for third-party candidates who will not win again and again and again. And the rest of us simply will not vote. And no, we're not all lazy. We're not all uneducated. We're not all unable to go to the polls. Some of us are registered voters, and we are very educated, and yet we will not vote. I would wager that whoever wins the presidency this year may get less than 1/4 of eligible votes in this election. That means on the day after the election, 3/4 of Americans will have a president that they did not vote for. And so how can you restore democracy to this country? True democracy? The type of democracy our founding fathers fought against? The type of democracy James Otis imagined in 1762, 12 years before the Declaration of Independence, when he coined the phrase, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." Yes, our colonial ancestors were taxed by King George, but they had no representation in Parliament. This was the reason that our ancestors fought for our freedom. This exact condition exists today in our country. And there's only one way that we can restore the voting process, or create a voting process which restores the intent of democracy. And that's through a constitutional amendment. This is the type of action that was required to give women the right to vote in this country, to give people of all races the right to vote, to give 18-year-olds the right to vote. And so, you may say, there's no way. We can't achieve that. And I understand. Why would the two parties who would have to approve a constitutional amendment do so when it would limit their power and basically yield the monopoly dead? 3/4 of the states would have to call for a convention. 2/3 of the House or Senate, House and Senate at the national level is the other option, would have to approve a constitutional amendment. Why would they do that? They have both stones in our hands. They know that either stone keeps them in power. Well, before I tell you about the two mechanisms I believe could help us, let me finish the story about the farmer's daughter. She was panicked. Her palms were sweating. The blood had rushed from her face. Her father saw panic in her eyes. And yet, in a moment of great clarity, the farmer's daughter threw away one of the stones. It landed in amongst all the other stones in the cobbled street. No one saw what color it was. And her father said, "Open your hand, daughter." She did. It was the black stone. Unless the king accused himself of cheating, she must have thrown away the light-colored stone. And with that, she secured her freedom by being smart, but also being observant. So to win this battle against the king, we must know we have two stones, and they are both dark. We must know that the root problem is first past the post voting. And we must find the solution, which is a constitutional amendment. And at ourvoiceparty.org, I've defined two ways that I believe it could be done. It does not mean that there could not be a third way or a fourth. But these two ways are the two ways that I will leave you with. The first is to create a majority party by focusing on the issues that a majority of Americans agree upon and think are the priority, and ignoring the fringe issues which the duopoly, the establishment, the two parties, keep in front of us to divide us, to keep us from seeing the two black stones. That's right. The vision is called Uniting People for a Change. It has 20 articles, very specific. I want to just read one to you. The first one. Article 1, United People for a Change. We see in America where all citizens honor the sacrifice of our ancestors. From the pioneers who died forging this rock we call home, to the soldiers who bled and died on beach and desert, in forest, jungle, or field to give us freedom, democracy, prosperity, and a nation indivisible with liberty and justice, not for the prosperous, the fortunate, the few, but for all. We oppose all labels that divide Americans, that make us suspect, fear, or turn against each other, that make us forget we live and die as one. We bleed red, then white and blue, and that before all else, we are called the United People of America. The second mechanism at ourvoiceparty.org is borrowed from the founders. I essentially thought about James Otis in 1764. This man is totally obscure even today, as I will be 200 years from now. But he was not afraid to coin the phrase, taxation without representation is tyranny. And based upon that, 12 years later, we had the Declaration of Independence. And so, my friends, today we now have the Declaration of Democracy. I've created a petition for it. You can sign it. You can ask others to sign it. And there are additional steps to help cement that and encourage Americans to find it in the future. As in the original Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Democracy is using the structure and wording of the Declaration of Independence. in terms of its grievances. It has grievances just as our founding fathers listed against King George. Today, this has 15 grievances. An example. Number 1. The first past the post voting process produces what are consistently and rightly judged 2 viable party choices among the unfortunate many parties considered incapable of election. Number 2. In turn, the 2 party choices lead a minority of Americans to stay the course of their conscience and vote happily for their offering of leadership. Number 3. Yet also in turn, the 2 party choices lead a majority of Americans to despair of conscience. Whether they stay the course of their conscience while voting with an absolute knowledge their vote has been cast for a third party candidate who cannot win, or whether they stay the course of their conscience and cast no vote at all, finding no moral comfort in either of the 2 party choices and therefore vote not at all, as a vote for any other than one of the 2 parties is a futile exercise of democracy, and lends what is, in reality, a completely illegitimate choice then greater legitimacy. Or whether they despair the process completely by systemic disenfranchisement, complexity of access, suspicion of tampering, or the advantages wielded by party rules. The 2-party system results created and maintained by the first past the post voting process has produced president after president elected by less than 3 in 10 eligible voters. The grievances move on, and then they continue to propose solutions. We ask that the voting process be replaced by a constitutional amendment drafted by non-partisan voting advocacy scholars, which promises these marks within its character, its new course. It shall provide for proportional representation from multiple parties, reward coalition building, and punish partisanship. It shall ensure a majority of citizens are represented by result. It shall restore public confidence in the authenticity of results and resolve one common method of voter registration, voting, and vote reporting. And it goes on. I ask you to sign this Declaration of Democracy, because only you can make this change. America did not win its independence because James Otis had a bright idea. It didn't win its independence because our founding fathers met in Philadelphia in 1776 and signed the Declaration of Independence. No, it didn't. It exists because ordinary Americans, like the colonial soldier freezing to death, watching his friends die from wounds or disease, on January 1st of 1777, 6 months after the signing of Declaration of Independence, he re-enlisted to fight again. And on January 3rd, those soldiers defeated tyranny for the first time on the Princeton battlefield. Now, my friends, it is ordinary Americans who are the seed, the root, the foundation of democracy. But if you do not know, you have 2 stones in your hands, and they are both black, you will never learn to throw the stone away. I invite you to utilize these tools and more. You'll find how to discredit establishment politicians by showing Americans you are at the polls with your registration card and you are boycotting the major parties. That will create awareness in Americans that it isn't just lazy, uneducated, uninformed voters who are not voting, that we are boycotting a broken process. And after the election, report to Our Voice Party the results that you have at your local, state, and national level about the illegitimacy of your candidates. A senator with 17% of the vote, a president with 24%, a congressman at the state level with 12%. And let's put their names with the percentage of eligible votes they've received on our cars. I don't care if it's duct tape and magic marker. In fact, that's even better. Because we want to show the American people that democracy is dead. And the only way that we can get it back is to know we have two dark stones in our hand and throw one to the street, exposing what will never be fixed unless we do. And with that, I am going to exit from American political discussion. I've learned so much. I appreciate so much that everyone has taught me. I hope that my contribution may help others in the future with understanding what I believe is the root cause of our issue and also what could potentially solve the issue. The stone is in your hands. Thank you, and good night.